Hello and welcome back to Christie's Cozy Corner. And this video is going to be my December wrap up because I haven't done one yet, which is ironic because I've already done a bunch of other end of year videos like my series update and my best and worst books. So this video is probably going to be a shorter one because I only read 4 books in December, so not too much to talk about. So we're just going to start off with the first book that I finished in December, and that is Fool's Fate by Robin Hobb. This is of course the third and final book to her Tawny Man trilogy and is the third series overall in her Realm of the Elderlings series. And because this is the conclusion to that trilogy, there really isn't much that I can say about this book that I haven't already said when I talked about the first 2 books of the series. And pretty much everything that I felt about those 2 books, I felt the same way in here as well. This is of course one of my favorite series of all time, and this book in particular was a reread. Although when I first read this series, I think the first book in the Tawny Man trilogy was my favorite, and I remember really enjoying Fool's Fate as well, but Fool's Errand just happened to stick in my mind more. However, upon this reread, this book just hit so much harder. And as we all know, I am someone who cries very easily when I read. I cry pretty much reading almost every book, or at least I do tend to tear up quite often. But this book is truly something special when it comes to that, because this book just had me bawling. So this series is about our main character, Fitz Chivalry Farseer, and that first trilogy follows Fitz in his life starting from when he's 6 years old until he's about 20. And then this series is now set 15 years later when he is 35. So Fitz has definitely grown and matured in a lot of ways, but then in other ways also stayed the same, because he is still as dense as ever when it comes to certain things. And if you read this series, you know what I'm talking about, especially when it comes to his relationship with one of the main characters of this series. And that relationship is the one that just gets to me the most. It encapsulates at least 80% of my investment and emotions in this entire series. And in this book, a lot of the things that Fitz has kind of been dancing around on the edge of throughout the entire series finally comes to a head, and he has to confront them and deal with them, and it just makes for so many emotional scenes that are mostly cathartic, but then also some are kind of just like, why did you wait this long to do this? And with this book, this now ends my reread of this series, because this is the furthest that I have gotten in this series. So after this, I will be picking up the Rainweld Chronicles and then subsequently the Fitz and the Fool trilogy. But up until this point that I have read in the series, the Tawny Man trilogy is definitely my favorite, and this third book is probably my favorite of that as well. The only things that I really had issues with is the direction that some of the things went, especially when it came to the characters and how things kind of ended up. It's not my favorite ending in the world, especially when it comes to certain character relationships, although there were other parts of the ending that I felt were done perfectly. So it's really like a toss-up, because most things I absolutely loved, but there's one thing in particular I'm like, I just wish it didn't end up this way. But alas, that is how things played out, and honestly, it's not even that big of a deal, and I would still give this entire series a 5 stars across the board. So that's it for the Tawny Man trilogy. And also, if you want to hear more spoilery thoughts, we also had a discussion about this book on Bethany's channel, which I will link down below, and we had 3 separate discussions for this entire trilogy, 1 for each book, so definitely check those out if you are interested. And then the next book that I finished in December was Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson. There are some things that I would like to say about this one. So first of all, I also participated in a discussion about this book over on Elliot Brooks's channel, and we did a discussion for both Oathbringer and Rhythm of War in that video. And because I had to make it in time for that discussion, I had to read this very quickly. I think I pretty much read the majority of this book in like 4 or 5 days, and I really regret that decision. I think doing so really affected my enjoyment of it and was a detriment to my overall reading experience, specifically because I had to do immersion reading for this so I could get through it as quickly as possible. And so I had to listen to the audiobook, which is narrated by Michael Kramer and Kate Redding. And I have not listened to any of the Stormlight Archive audiobooks before because I'm just not really a fan of the audiobooks. And so for the previous books, I only read them physically. So firstly, it was a little bit jarring to pick this up and listen to the audiobook for it, especially because I've already been with these characters for so long in my own head that I have very distinct voices for them. So listening to how they sound on the audiobook, it took a while to get used to. And I also just think that with the speed that I had to go through this book, there were probably a lot of moments that just didn't have as much of an impact as they would if I had read it only physically. Like, I was on a nonstop time crunch. I could not stop for any reason. So when it came to like those emotional kind of scenes, I didn't really get a chance to pause and take it all in. I kind of just had to push forward as fast as possible. And again, I just really regret that decision because I ended up not really loving this one as much as I did the initial 3 books. And because of that, I can't really tell if it's because of that reason or if I just actually did not enjoy this book as much, because in addition to my reading experience, there were also just some kind of like plot things going on that I wasn't really into. So I definitely want to give this book another chance and give it a reread. I set it as unrated for the longest time on my Goodreads, but then I finally settled on giving it a 4 stars. I can't remember if it was like a 4 or 4.5, but honestly, I think it's more of a 4 if I'm really taking everything into consideration. So one thing about this series, especially when it comes to this latest installment, and it's something that I mentioned in my favorite books of the year video when I talked about this series, because this whole series, especially Oathbringer, is still one of my favorite books of the year. But as I mentioned in that video, I just feel like the entire plot and world of Stormlight, and especially the cosmere, because this book has opened up a lot of things in the cosmere, I just feel like everything has gotten way too big and kind of just lost me. And I have to be honest, with the direction that everything is kind of going, I'm just not sure if I'm the biggest fan of what is happening in the cosmere. And I think especially when it comes to the villains, I just really don't feel much about them at all. For example, going back to Mistborn Era 1, which I'm always going to bring up because it is one of my favorites. Going back to that series, I just felt like the stakes were so much higher because everything had so much consequence. And I guess like the stakes are really high because now we're talking about like the overall cosmere, but I just don't feel like as invested in that overall story. And I think it's because it's just gotten so big. Like one thing that Elle mentioned in the discussion video that we did, and I completely agree with, is I just really miss the days of this series when it was its own contained story and its own contained world. Like, there's just something so nostalgic and not exactly cozy, but that's the word I'm gonna use, cozy, about the Way of Kings, because it was all just focused on this one war going on the Shattered Plains, and it was just familiar, and it was easy to attach yourself to it, and you feel like you are looking at everything from the center of it all. But when it comes to this now, when everything has gotten so big, I don't know, I just feel like I'm kind of just like on the sidelines, just glancing in. I'm kind of just like some outside casual observer. I don't know if any of that makes any sense or if anyone else feels the same way, but that's the best way that I can think of to describe like what is kind of missing now in my feelings towards where this series and the overall cosmere is going. But cosmere connections aside, I still really loved all the characters and their own individual journeys, especially one plotline in this book with one of the main characters and their dynamic with another new character that was just introduced. I thought all of their scenes together and what they were working on was so captivating, and I just wanted more of that. And of course, I again love to see how these characters grow and develop. And as everyone mentions about the mental health representation in Stormlight Archive, it is really something that is unique in this series and I don't see a lot in other ones. And I just love how it shows that it's not a completely linear journey and healing is not just a one-way street. There are times where you're going to get better, but then something else might happen that make you take a step back. So those were the kinds of things that really pulled me in and had me more invested in the story and the characters. So in general, I just think it's like the overall macro plot of the Cosmere that I'm kind of just like, whatever happens, happens. We'll just see how it goes. I don't really have any kind of stake in it either way. And the next book that I finished in December, kind of similarly, is The Lost Metal by Brandon Sanderson, the last book in Mistborn Era 2. Now, different from Era 1, which I absolutely loved, I still really enjoyed Era 2, but I still really liked it and I think it's a really good series, but it just doesn't live up to the reputation of Era 1, There's just something so special and unique in Mistborn Era 1. But one thing that I really love in Mistborn Era 2, and it's something that I continue to have interest in, is just seeing how the world and technology and everything develops and seeing how allomancy and the other magic systems adapt to all of those changes. And it's something that I'm really excited to see in future Mistborn series, like when Sanderson is going to go into more futuristic kind of stuff, and just seeing how that changes the use of allomancy and how creative people will get with these magic systems. So I gave this conclusion 4.5 stars because I had a really good time with it, and again, I just love the characters so much, especially Steris and Marasi. I love both their characters and their stories, and sometimes it does get a little bit cheesy, but it's the kind of stuff that, I just kind of eat up every single time, no matter how many times I read that kind of thing. And of course, the ending definitely made me cry because of course it did. And overall, I was just really satisfied with the conclusion of everything. So one thing that I didn't love, however, is that throughout this entire series, we're kind of following this one mystery. Like, it starts off as a very small thing in the first book, and as each book progresses, you kind of find out a little bit more and dig a little bit deeper, and it becomes a little bit bigger. And I just didn't love what ended up being the answer to that mystery. Like, honestly, I kind of thought that it was just kind of dumb. Like, I was like, this is it? Like this is what it's all about? Like, this is what's been happening the whole time? Like, what the heck? Like, what even is this? Was kind of my reaction. So that kind of brought it down a little bit because I was just like, not, this isn't the conclusion. This is not the answers that I wanted. And again, like I mentioned for Rhythm of War, it's also just the whole connection to the overall Cosmere. Like, I just really missed that cozy, familiar kind of feeling with this series back when it was more contained and a lot smaller. And I can definitely see why everyone is like, you should read as much as you can of the Cosmere before you read The Lost Metal. And I totally agree, which is funny because when my partner read this series, he started off with Mistborn Era 1, didn't read anything else, just read the entire Mistborn series all the way through from the Final Empire to The Lost Metal without touching anything else in the Cosmere. And afterwards, he's like, yeah, you can enjoy this series on its own without being familiar with any of the Cosmere connections. And I gotta say, he is dead wrong, because some of the things that happen in this book kind of ruin other things in the Cosmere. Like, I guess if you haven't read the other Cosmere stuff, like, you wouldn't know that they were ruined, but I just feel like you had to read it in the other order. Like, you had to read the other books first and then get to this one. Or I just feel like it's just like not the same kind of mind-blowing feeling that you would get. You would kind of just read it and be like, yeah, okay, like, whatever, that's fine. But if you read the other Cosmere stuff first and then you read this one, then it's gonna be more like a holy shit, what the heck, Sanderson does it again kind of feeling, And I really hope that doesn't give away too much, and I'm really trying to be as vague as possible with this, and I don't really think like it's a spoiler to mention that there are Cosmere connections and there are like holy shit moments, because like it's Sanderson we're talking about. This is what he is known for. So that was my experience with The Lost Metal, and with that I am now caught up in Stormlight as well as the Mistborn series, and I just have a couple of more books to read until I can officially be caught up in the cosmere, because thanks to my friend Daniel, who so very kindly pointed out that I had not yet read Yumi or The Sunlit Man, I can't say that I am completely caught up with the cosmere. So I'm sorry for lying to everybody about that. And finally, the last book that I read in December and for the entire year of 2023 is City of Nightmares by Rebecca Schaeffer. This one is the first book in a YA urban fantasy, and it was just such a great book to end the year on because I had such a great time with it. The entire book was just so much fun and really ended the year on a positive reading note for me. And I also buddy read this book with my friend Maggie, who just recently started her own YouTube channel, which is so exciting, Dog-Eared Pages, which I will link down below, so please do check her out. I feel like she and I have pretty similar tastes in reading, and it was just so much fun buddy reading this with her because we had like all the same reactions to all the same scenes. So this series is an urban fantasy that is our world in its setting, but something happened where people, when they go to sleep and they have nightmares, there is a possibility that they will morph into those nightmares. So for example, if you are really scared of spiders, there's a chance that you might have a nightmare about a giant spider and end up turning into one yourself and killing your entire family, which is exactly what happened to the main character in this book. Her older sister turned into a giant spider and killed her family, which honestly like sounds kind of silly, and I thought it was really silly too when I read it, but you kind of just have to go with it because this entire book is kind of like that, where it just is really silly in a lot of ways but is still so much fun. And I just found the world building to be so interesting and creative because there is so much potential that could be built from this idea. Like some of the nightmares that people have are not necessarily things that are life-threatening. Like not everyone is going to turn into a giant monster. Like some of the things that people can have nightmares about are things that are more of their deep-seated fears. Like for example, there is one person in this book who has like a very ogre-like appearance. Although he still has the same personality, he's still the same person on the inside, but it's just his physical appearance that changed. And it's likely he looks like this because the thing he was afraid of was maybe a childhood bully. And when you're a kid and faced against a bully that is a lot stronger and bigger than you, you kind of exaggerate their features so that they seem a lot bigger and scarier. So that's what his nightmare was, and he turned into that kind of appearance. So it's just really interesting, all the kind of like little creative things that you can do with it, and you can definitely tell the author had a lot of fun thinking up a lot of these things. The writing is also so funny, and there were so many times where I laughed out loud or I had to take a screenshot of my ebook and share it with Maggie and just like completely laugh my ass off. And that is mainly thanks to the main character Ness, who is someone who is terrified of all nightmares after that traumatic experience with her sister turning into a nightmare and killing their family. And Ness is just one of the most relatable characters that I have ever read because she is very much like, let someone else take care of that. I don't want to deal with it. Like, oh, does this sound cowardly? Well, that sounds about right because I'm a coward. So it's stuff like that that was just so entertaining and really endeared me to Ness and this entire story. And I had this book as my biggest surprises of the year because it actually has like not that high of a rating on Goodreads, which is really surprising because I enjoyed it so much and I thought it was so good. I think it's probably because people just have the wrong expectation about this going in because it is really quite silly sometimes, and you know, if you're not expecting that kind of thing, it might be a little bit jarring. Some of the writing is also like a little bit meta, which again might not be for everybody. And another thing that I thought this book did a really great job with is also its mental health representation and the way it talks about mental health, because our main character is scared of everything and has PTSD, and the way that the book talks about how she deals with that is very realistic. And that's another thing as well, like it is very silly and lighthearted at times, but it also balances against these more serious and important topics. So overall, I just had a really great time with it, and I would recommend anyone to pick it up if you're just in like a silly, goofy mood sometimes. time. And if I have not mentioned, I gave this book 4.5 stars. So that's it for all of the books that I read in December. Ended off on a super high note with me loving most of my reads, having some issues with little parts of it, but still generally really loving everything, as I gave everything mostly 4 or 4.5 or 5 stars. So that's it for this video. Let me know in the comments if you read any of these books and what you thought of them, especially if you want to discuss the Cosmere books and potential spoilers. Just make sure all those spoilers are hidden. And thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again in my next one. Bye!